Hello, welcome back. It is Wednesday the 24th, 1 p.m. Pacific time. Today, I have a very special guest, the co-owner winemaker of Gramercy Cellars, Mr. Greg Harrington. He will be joining me momentarily. For those of you who do not know me, I am Anthony Mueller, the wine advocate reviewer for Washington State. Let's connect with Greg now. Hey, Greg.
Hey, Anthony. How you doing?
Very well. So yourself?
Fantastic.
Thank you so much for taking time out of your busy day to connect with me. I know that even though we're under a global pandemic, things are still happening around the vineyard and all that fun stuff. So for those of our viewers that don't know who you are, perhaps even in the UK or EU, could you go ahead and introduce yourself and give us a quick background?
Yeah, sure. So my name is Greg Harrington, and I pretty much spent my life from even before I was 21 in the restaurant and wine business. I went to Cornell after doing working in family Italian restaurants in New York on Long Island, where I grew up, and figured I would be a restaurant designer. And then the company that hired every year at Cornell didn't hire in 1992. So I went into operations, cooked for a little while, and figured it was way more fun to be in the front of the house. And they gave me a management job, and I kind of dabbled in the wine list, and then woke up one day and I was like, wow, this sommelier thing is fun. And at the time, there was really only a couple of places you could really be a sommelier. So I said, well, I either got to go to New York City or San Francisco. So I figured, well, I kind of grew up on the outskirts of New York City and spent a lot of time there. Let's try San Francisco. So I threw everything I owned in the world in my car, drove to San Francisco, and knocked on a couple of doors and randomly got a manager job with a restaurant called Square One. This really influential chef, at the time is still influential, named Joyce Goldstein, who was doing Mediterranean cuisine.
Nice.
And they had a great sommelier, a great history of wine, and they hired me as a manager. And then about a year after I got there, Peter Granoff, who was a sommelier, decided to start a company called virtualvineyards.com. And the interesting thing about virtualvineyards.com, besides the fact that I was like, why would you ever want to sell anything on the internet besides wine? He would actually be mentioned in the same articles and sentences as Jeff Bezos. It was basically Jeff Bezos, the book guy, and Peter Granoff, the wine guy. So they made me the sommelier, and it just kind of rolled from there. I went to work for Lagasse, and I ran all of Lagasse's restaurants in New Orleans, and did some consulting for a distribution company in Nevada when Bellagio opened and bought. It was great. They gave me like $1 million to go buy rare wine around the world. Awesome. Things like 61 Petrus and Old Obrion, and
cool.
And I worked for Wolfgang Puck for a while. And after my last job was in New York City, running a big restaurant company in New York City. Just buying a lot of wine, a lot of spirits, and operating restaurants in a independent and hotel environment. And one day woke up and said, it's time to do something else. And just kind of fell into winemaking. It wasn't a plan. It just kind of happened.
Yeah, I have a lot of respect for restaurant people. I myself have over 2 decades of restaurant experience. Growing up in Phoenix, I worked for all the major resorts, and it takes a special type of person to stick with a restaurant job. But yeah, what happens is, I think a lot of people in the restaurant positions ultimately end up being influenced by their chefs and by their wine list, and get bit by the wine bug and just go full in. And
there you go. Yeah, it's funny when I went from the sommelier world to the wine world, there was all this thing of, well, you're a somm, how could you make wine? And there were only a couple of sommeliers who had actually started making wine. It was like Emmanuel Camigi in California and Mike Bonacorsi in California. But what I realized quickly when I actually sat and thought about it, a winery is really just a restaurant in slow motion. And if you kind of think about it, your winemaker is your chef de cuisine or your executive chef, and your front of house, so your tasting room, your direct to consumer, that's just like running front of house stuff. So you're doing the same hospitality particularly in the tasting room, I'm thinking about creating the same kind of experiences, even in terms of, is the lighting right? Is the mood right? Is the music right compared to the number of people? And, it all comes down to, particularly in this day and age, is people are looking for an experience. So obviously in a restaurant, your food has to be on point. And your beverage program has to be on point, and your wine has to be on point in the winery, but they want something else. So, you have to create that experience for them. And just being in a beautiful vineyard and a beautiful setting, which you've been to the winery, we're not, you have to give them something more, and you have to tell your story, and it's really important. But it's very close to the restaurant business.
For sure. So being in the restaurant industry for so long, how much of an adjustment was it for you to move from the restaurant side of things into the winery side of things and branding and winemaking and all that?
It was relatively similar, although the feedback is not instant. In my day in the restaurant business, we didn't have things like Yelp and all the social media. Someone would actually have to complain to the manager, or would actually, have to write a letter. And you answer them and call them, and that's how you got your feedback. Now, feedback is instantaneous, even while someone's actually sitting at a table. Yeah. And that to me was the biggest difference is just the length of time. It takes, in a restaurant, the entire experience is over in 2 hours, and you're basically prepping for a day. So it's a much shorter time frame. And, we make decisions that'll affect us in wine 2 years out, 10 years out. In vineyards, it can affect you over 100 years. So in that way, it seems maybe it's there's a little less weight and a little more weight, because you're like, well, grandkids can deal with that decision. That's not my problem. But facetious, obviously. But I actually thought that the slowness of the actual wine business would kind of get boring, but I found it everything but, because you actually have time to really analyze the things you've done. And in a restaurant, I can't compare the chicken dish that I did last week to the chicken dish I'm doing today, because you just can't do that. But I can look at 10 vintages of a particular Syrah and say, wow, I really liked what we did in 2008 and how it aged. So we can analyze a lot more. Obviously, we're susceptible to what nature gives us, because that's the whole game. But it's a fantastic business. I love everything about it.
For sure. Yeah, I've spoken with you on a few occasions, and people who don't know you, I think just by observing you, they know that you're high energy, you talk quick, you think quick, and a winemaker's game is really long distance thinking. Has that been a challenge for you?
Yeah, well, I'll answer your question in two ways. One of the hardest things for me was, obviously, I didn't go to enology school. I don't really have a viticultural degree, things like that. And for me, the most important thing is I don't have history on a lot of these vineyards. You look at Syrah in Washington State; it wasn't even planted until 1988 when when Cellars chef and David Lake decided to plant Syrah. Yeah. You go to some place like Jean-Louis Chave, and I think Chave says that he has actual cellar notes back to the 1730s or something crazy like that. Imagine being able to even be able to look back 100 years and say, well, we tried this trellising in 1926 and it didn't work, or we tried this in 1952, and so a lot of our things, everything I do, I'm the first generation to do it. So I don't have I have friends who've been in the business since the 70s, but in terms of wine, that's that's like getting into the business yesterday. It's these things are generational. I think it gives me the ability to explore. So, we can do things like I purchased a vineyard in 2006 and it had Tempranillo, and I went, I don't know about Washington Tempranillo, we'll see. Turned out it was really good. Turned out that it actually made something that looked like Tempranillo, but then, kind of as we went on, I said, it's good Tempranillo, but it's really great Cabernet Franc site. So we switched it over to Cab Franc. So I'm always cautious of making sure that we do some experimentation. But I think particularly in the new world, and particularly in our region, you can end up going in 13 different directions.
For sure.
And your winery gets unfocused, and there's a lot of a lot of what winemaking is working with the same piece of ground year after year after year, and kind of saying, how do we get the best out of this piece of ground, whether it's a good vintage, bad vintage, mediocre vintage, and that to me is the real challenge of winemaking. And if you're consistently working with different pieces of land, and even in different spots in a vineyard, you just can't develop that focus and intensity and attention to detail that it takes to make wine at the highest level. You can make stuff that tastes great, but I kind of describe to a lot of the customers that come, to go from this point to this point might take 10 years, but to go another half step might take 50 years, and another half step and 10 times the amount of work. Yeah. So incrementally to continue to improve gets, to me, infinitely harder. And that to me is amazingly fun and amazingly challenging.
For sure. I've always appreciated the winemakers who will look at the land and figure out what needs to be planted there. First identify the plot of land that needs to be planted, then figure out what needs to be planted there. Because there's nothing more, heartbreaking than wanting to grow a single varietal because you love it so much, and then looking at the land and realizing that land isn't necessarily good for that varietal, and having to switch gears. So let's talk about your goals when you first began with Gramercy. What did you set out to achieve when you first started with Gramercy Cellars?
So yeah, just kind of back to the story of how I got here. I was tasting with Norm McKibben, who he's kind of like one of the founders of the area and influences so many different wineries. But he owns Pepper Ridge Winery and Lake Colleen Winery, and my wife and I, we were just tasting wine, checking out Washington because we had met some of the winemakers, and I had been fascinated with Washington my entire career. And we're tasting Syrah from Lake Colleen Vineyard, and I just happened to make a random comment. It was like, if I was ever going to make wine, I'd want to make that. And he goes, well, we'll sell your fruit. And I went, I don't know how to make wine. He goes, you're some, you'll figure it out. Or just come work harvest and we'll teach you. And we all kind of laughed. And I went back home, and about a month later, I said to my wife, I said, what do you think about me working harvest? She's like, I think it's great. If you get the time off from the restaurants, why not go do it, spend a month? And it just happened to be a crazy vintage because it was 2004, and we can go into what the different problems in Washington harvest can be, but this was a freeze year, and it was a year where it went below zero for a long time, and most of Walla Walla had to be cut down. So there was no harvest whatsoever in 2004 in Walla Walla, except in a few tiny little places. And so I actually got to see a huge portion of Washington State, because one thing that Chateau Ste. Michelle did, Chateau Ste. Michelle realized how disastrous that 2000 freeze was going to be for the wine industry, and opened up a lot of their vineyards to smaller wineries so that they could actually just have something to be able to keep themselves afloat for the next year. So I saw vineyards like Canoe Ridge Merlot and Cold Creek Cabernet and stuff on Red Mountain, and so it was like, I was like, wow, I came here to learn Walla Walla, but I'm actually learning everything. So it was a great experience. And then my focus here was really to learn Syrah. I just wanted to make one Syrah. Now I make like 15 wines, but that's a whole nother story. But it was really one Syrah. And a friend of mine named Jamie Brown, he kind of toured me around what he thought the best Syrah sites were. He had a brand called James Lee, which turned into Waters Winery, and he introduced me to I had Lake Colleen from Norm, but he introduced me to a site called Forgotten Hills, which is a very, very rocky soil, very cold site at the base of the Blue Mountains. Our goal with Syrah is always to put it in the coldest spot possible. I don't work with something like Andy Pay works with in the Sonoma Coast, but we work with relatively cold sites for the most part. And then you help with a vineyard called Minnick in Prosser, and realized very, very quickly that we had two different styles of wine on the table. So we had Le Colline, which was more, if you could say, darker red fruit. You know, when I say red fruits, you know, things like strawberries, strawberries, cranberries, you know, fruits that are red. But they were on the darker side of that, and kind of blueberry, where Forgotten Hills and Minnick were all the way on the red spectrum. And blending them together, you know, a lot of times you say, well, I'm going to blend those fruits together and they're going to get more complex. And one of the things that's amazing with wine is sometimes you can take two amazing lots and blend them together and they're awful. And sometimes you can take two mediocre lots and blend them together and they're absolutely fantastic. So, you know, what we've really learned going forward is you really have to, you got to trust what the vineyard is going to give you, and you can't force the vineyard to give you something that it doesn't want to give. So you have to be, well, A, one, figure that out, and then B, be willing to live with what that vineyard is going to give you. You know, sometimes you have a site that wants to be picked really early. Sometimes you have a site that just wants to be picked late, and it doesn't always correlate with, you know, a warm site wants to be picked earlier and a cold site wants to be picked later. You got to figure out what the sweet spot is. And it was just apparent that with the Syrah I was working with, there were two different styles, and I didn't want to have to force everything. So we started out with two wines, and then said I was never ever going to make Cabernet. You know, I was coming from New York City, Somm game. I was way too cool to make Cabernet. So then I made my first 1,000 cases of Cab in 2006. So I am fully adaptable. But, you know, for me, one of the fortunate things was, you know, a lot of people think that when you start a winery, you know, you basically go to the region, you either purchase a winery, you go to the region and you buy some land, and then you let the land grow up and get to 5-7 years, and then you build your winery, and then, you know, so on and so on. And that is really, really farthest from the truth. You know, most people, a lot of wineries have 10 wineries working in them. So, and you would never know that. So we rented a space in another winery, which was a great experience. Mostly because, well, I had fun. There were great people working there, but I got to see many more things than I was actually working with, and it gave me 10 years of harvest experience in 1 year, because I got to see 7 or 8 different winemakers doing 7 or 8 different things with different fruit, and I got to see fruit from all over Washington State. So quickly, particularly with Cabernet, I was like, wow. Shampoo Vineyard, that's amazing. I love Andrew Will's Sorella wine. I still think it's the top cab made in Washington State. So I was looking for Shampoo Vineyard, ended up right across the street with the Bechtel family at Finney Hill. You know, was really in love with Pepperbridge Vineyard, and you know, contracted some stuff at Pepperbridge Vineyard. So you know, kind of slowly said, you know, we're going to run a full Rhone program, and we're going to run a full Bordeaux program, which I think for Washington is very natural. Kind of going back to, you know, as a winery, you really have to control to stay focused, because and sometimes I can be envious of a place like the Willamette Valley, where it's basically like you make Chardonnay and Pinot, and that's it. You may make some Gamay, you may make some Riesling, you may make some Pinot Gris, but you're really, the region is focused on that. Or, you know, you inherit a Barolo winery, and, you know, you do Nebbiolo, Barbera del Cetto. So I'm really focused on making sure that I am not scattered in what we do. And we've kind of just grown from there. And in the beginning, the idea, you know, for me, the idea is always balance. I want to be careful and not say low alcohol, although that is my ultimate goal, is low alcohol. I think balance is more important. Having a wine that's not over acidic and not over tannic, just to say we're 12.5% alcohol doesn't help anyone. Eventually, you know, it doesn't even help my ego, because people hate the wine. And I'm making wine not for a number. I'm making wine for enjoyment and pleasure, and to make people happy. So balance is always the most important thing. And then for me, it's a combination of fruit and earth. So old world, new world flavors. You know, in Washington, you can make very, very fruity wines, and you can make very, very earthy wines. But I find if you back to that sweet spot of the vineyard, you can really have a beautiful balance where the California wine drinker goes, wow, I actually like this. And even the Bordeaux wine drinker or the Coberty wine drinker goes, wow, I actually really like this. So, and then obviously I try to make wines that age, sometimes at the expense of wines being open and ready to drink when we actually release them. So I try to release on a little bit later cycle, but I would rather, for me, I'm looking for our Syrahs and Cabs to kind of start getting into that real interesting phase where they're not just primary fruit and all the fun stuff is developing somewhere between 5 to 7 years. That's kind of with the upper end wines. The lower end wines, the lower Riesling line that we have, I want to make that as delicious as possible the day we release it. But the higher end wines, in the early years, you're gonna have to think about them for a while, or decant them and be a little patient.
Awesome. I've always said that for people who have a California palate, who want to consider or get into a old world French palate, you have to take them through the Pacific Northwest, whether it be for Pinot in Oregon or Syrah or Cabernet from Washington, and vice versa. I think if you have a European palate that enjoys French Pinot, Syrah, Cab, if you want to get into California, kind of warm up gradually, I think going through the Pacific Northwest, through Washington, Oregon to get to California, I think is a natural fluid step rotation through there. So you talked about a lot of
totally
bottlings with growing different varietals and looking at different plots of land that give you different expressions of your bottlings, and all the varietals you work with. Which is your favorite to create?
To create?
To create, like to make.
Oh, yeah, it's a tough question. Even though I knew the answer, I knew the question was coming. It's still a tough question.
It's not a very fair question. It's like asking, which is your favorite child? It's like you can't do it, but
yeah,
which
but
is the most rewarding for you to make?
Yeah, I have to ask. I got to give you two wines for very different reasons, because there's definitively one wine that we 100%. I don't do anything. The vineyard does all the work. So, our Forgotten Hills bottling. We've spent a lot of time. When I bought the vineyard, it was more conventionally farmed, and now I've switched it over to all organic farming. But when I make that wine, besides blending the two different clones, we have two different Rhone clones that we blend in pretty much the same fashion every single year. I don't do anything. I always ferment it in concrete. It's always 100% whole cluster. It's always stored in 500-liter puncheons to about 20 hectoliter puncheons. So basically bigger casks that are totally neutral. And put it in bottle after about 15 months. So there's not a lot that I need to do. But what I love about this wine is it has the aromas of Pinot Noir with the intensity that Nebbiolo can have. And it's not Nebbiolo or Pinot Noir by any stretch of the imagination, but it just kind of reminds me kind of the aromatics and the power that both of those varieties can display in different ways. But I don't have to do anything to make that wine. So I love showing people that wine. I don't really have to do anything. And our John Lewis wine from Lake Helene is kind of the exact same way. To actually make, I find Cabernet to be insanely interesting and fun to make, because now we're really on a blending model as opposed to a single vineyard model when it comes to Cab. But even if I'm on a single vineyard model, I'm still looking at most likely two varieties. It's very rare that you're going to have 100% Cab. You got to have really special Cabernet site to be able to do that. I can't even think of there might be one, but I can't even think of 100% Cab made in Bordeaux at the highest level. Again, there may be one, but I can't think of one. So you're always going to have Cab. You're always going to have below.
In certain vintages.
Wait, which one?
Said no, there are, but it's only in certain vintages that it's very rare.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, it's rare. And then we have Cabernet Franc, and we don't use Malbec, and then Petit Verdot. So crafting these wines and having the hardest thing is when do you say, okay, we're there? And that to me was the hardest thing, and that really what took a long time, is to be able to trust my palate enough, because you're not drinking finished wines you're not drinking wines that are ready to drink. So you have to be able to adjust your palate to project out.
Yes.
And when in the early days, I'd have to remind everyone, I have kind of a core group of 4 of us that been blending together for like the past 12 years. I got to say, if it tastes good now, it's not right. You have to imagine that it's going to taste good 5 years from now. And so that to me is super interesting part. So kind of the 1-2 answer, but
for sure. No, I appreciate it. I was once asked to be part of a blending panel to make the wines of Inglenook. My last year there, the winemaker Philippe Pascal asked me to join him with Stefan Derencourt, and I said, that's an incredible honor, thank you, but I have to decline. I don't have any experience doing that. My experience is tasting wine and then reverting back to where it probably came from, what vintage, what soil, what land, what country. And he said something that I'll never forget. He says, a great wine is a great wine. When making wine, all you have to do is identify it and find out which one it is. And tasting barrel samples and trying to blend a wine and trying to find its identity is it's a skill set. It takes some time because you're looking at something that, as you said, it's not ready. You have to envision where it's going to be in 5, 10, 15, 20, 50 years, and hope you've done the right blend, and hope to God that it works, and you're on your way. Yeah. So with Gramercy Cellars, it has some really interesting names associated with your bottlings. Can you tell us what tempted you to name certain bottlings? Specifically your Mourvèdre, your Tempranillo, which unfortunately no longer exists, and your Syrahs.
Yeah, I've explained this so many times. I think I explain it differently every time that I talk about it. But when I think about my restaurant career, I chose to go to kind of a different route than a lot of somms. You would think that to be a somm, the ultimate thing would be to work for like Thomas Keller at the French Laundry, or Charlie Trotter, at Trotters when Trotters was open, and things like that. And they're amazing places to work because you're really working at the highest levels of service and attention to detail and complexity, because it's so hard to put together that dining experience. But I always gravitated towards the bigger, more fun restaurants that were super serious. You look at like what Wolfgang Puck did in Las Vegas. That restaurant could do, over the course of a day, between the cafe and the dining room, it could have 1,500 people come through. It was crazy. And it's not designed to be a Michelin 3-star, but every time you go, you get a really good meal. And that's kind of the attitude that I took in with everything that we do with wine. It's basically, we want to be really serious, but we want to be really fun. I think people immediately see that when they come. We're in basically a warehouse district across the street from a cement factory. So a lot of people walk up to our door and they're like, wait, where the heck am I? Well, why am I going to this place? And, you walk in and you can see that we try not to take ourselves too seriously. I don't want to, my tasting room experience is not like classical music and everything decked out to the nines with, art for sale on the wall. We're, playing Slayer sometimes, you never know. So, we're just trying to make it as interesting as possible. So, in terms of Tempranillo, I only expected to make it once, because I was going to rip out the vines eventually, and then I realized how good it was, and I just needed a Spanish name, and Princess Bride was on TV, so I was like, oh, Inigo Montoya, that'll be a great name. Yeah. And then the wine got lots and lots of press, and I went, wow, we just started. I'm going to get sued. I'm going to get a copyright violation right out of the gate. But then I looked on I looked on the internet and then realized that there's a lot of Princess Bride memorabilia that is not officially sold. So I was like, I think
one of those cult movies that no one really sees, but it's anyone who grew up, in that era, it's a staple. It's classic.
Yeah. I will tell you one thing I have done with that wine, because I noticed early on how well it was going to age. So since 2008, I've been putting 50 to 75 cases aside. So I have, 7 or 8 vintages with some pretty good amounts. And it's obviously not Reserva, Grand Reserva in the typical sense of what you would find in Rioja. But, every year we're going to taste every wine and then, say, hey, do we feel we have anything to release? And then kind of release those, not even necessarily in order. Maybe the 11's ready, but the 10 and the 9 aren't. So we're kind of just going to release them as the years come and kind of go anywhere from, the fruit of the Crianza to the complexity and secondary flavors of what you would find in a really old wine, like something like, what Lopez de Heredia is doing with their older bottlings and releases. So that's kind of how I'm looking at the Tempranillo. But and then, Lydia du Village, that kind of came from, one of the things that we do in Washington. People come to me all the time and they say, well, do you own your own vineyards? And yeah, we own 3 different vineyards. And it took me a long time to answer the question, because I realized that with consumers, and in a lot of places in the world, and even in our region, it usually does, if you own your own vineyard, there's a good chance that you're going to make really good wine for the most part. And I know you could put a lot of holes in that statement, but that's kind of the idea. But there's a consumer impression that you own the vineyard, it's going to be good. And my thing is, yeah, it's great to own the vineyard, but what's most important is you control all your fruit. So everything that we work with, we 100% control the farming on. So, I might not be the one driving the tractor all the time, but when they are driving the tractor, they're doing it to our specifications. And we've been, it's been amazing that we've been fortunate to work with growers who care about the farming aspect as much as we do. The Sauer family at Red Willow and the Bechtel family at Finney, they're amazing partners to work with. And one of the things we were able to do is, because of the way Washington was formed and it was homesteaded, a lot of people have lots of acreage for farming. So you can kind of walk around the property and go, hey, can we do head train Grenache here? And, on 3x3 with these 5 clones. So we've had 5 or 6 of these projects, and it was knowing that we were going to have some young vine fruit, particularly with Grenache and Syrah. I said, well, I kind of need like our version of Côte de Rhône, which went from Côte de Rhône to Côte de Rhône Village, which is a step up, which went to Village Idiot. So that's how that was originally formulated. And then Brandon and I, my partner in winemaking at the winery, he and I realized how good the Mourvèdre was and went, I don't want to make another wine, so let's sell off the young vine Grenache and Syrah and make a Mourvèdre, because the Mourvèdre in Washington it's maybe our best variety. It's an absolutely, I know there's growers out there that cringe when I say Mourvèdre might be our best variety, but it's absolutely stunning in Washington State.
For sure. Yeah, I was on a Washington trip in 2015 after I'd just left the French Laundry, and the very last day of the trip, I was sitting next to Avril Dunn, which works for the Washington State Wine Commission. And they had these unusual suspects, the non-typical varietals that are grown in Washington. And they asked me to identify it. And I was like, yeah, this is Mourvèdre. And they're like, that's very specific. I was like, I could be more specific. And she's like, what do you mean? It's like, I think this is 2012 Gramercy Cellars Mourvèdre. And the guy behind me is like, I saw you crush all of the white blind tastings, Albarino, Pinot Gris, Semillon, a few days ago. It's like, do you think it's the green label from this producer? It's like, no, it's Gramercy 2012. And Chris Tangy reveals what it is. And it's like 2012 Gramercy. It's like, so,
that's awesome.
That's
awesome.
It's such a unique varietal, and I think it has a lot of potential for Washington State. So talking about Tempranillo, it's not necessarily well known. I know that Christophe Baron has his Tempranillo in the rocks with his Horsepower Vineyard. Are there any other varietals that you like to work with in Washington that you're not currently working with right now, or you would at least consider working with?
Yeah, I think we're still on a search. If you don't want to do Riesling, I think you're still on a search for what is a great, or even a white variety that really shines in Washington State. And I think stuff like some of the Italian Campanian varieties like Greco or Falangina
Yeah.
or Fiano could really do well in Washington State. Yeah, figure if you could take the blazing sun of Campania, you can easily take the 2 months of heat that we have in Washington State. So I'd really like to plant Fiano. I think it's a variety that is super interesting, particularly when it's done by someone who really understands the farming and does it really, really well. But as I mentioned that, if you think of where the question of climate change always comes up, and where is Washington going, and unequivocally we're going up.
Yeah.
In Walla Walla, you could theoretically go up to 4,000, 4,500 feet and still not be at the highest levels. So I think we're going to see other varieties. Like, I could see things like, well, I know people are planting Riesling above 2,000 feet, but I could see things like Radicchio, Albarino. There's an Albarino project on the west side of the state, up near the Canadian border, that was planted by a Spanish importer. So I think that there's a lot of things that we could do. But I'd personally like to either make Radicchio or Fiano on the white side. Red, my goal in life would be to make Nebbiolo, but I'm not crazy enough to plan it, because to my mind, Nebbiolo.
Nebbiolo, yeah.
Nebbiolo, yeah. I think with a few exceptions, no one has really done great Nebbiolo outside of the Valtellina, or Lombardy or Piemonte. So I think that's a variety that's super tricky to make. There's a little bit of Gamay that I've talked to some people about, maybe making a little bit of Gamay. We do a little Pinot Noir out of the Willamette Valley, but I think on the red side, I can't really say that because I work with so many red varieties, I can't really say that, I really want to go make this. It's going to be in little small pieces of a little bit of this and a little bit of that. There's some Mongoose in, all the mountain varieties are starting to come out, Mongoose and Tannat, and Tannat's not a mountain variety, but it's esoteric for sure. So you're starting to see things like that come in.
Cool. So speaking about all the different possibilities for the future, where do you see the brand going in, say, 20 years?
That's a good question. I don't, for me, I think that, my wife and I own 3 vineyards. We don't have any kids. My partner in the business, Brandon, he has young kids, so I would love to see his kids eventually get involved in the winemaking. And as they get older, they're spending more and more time running around the winery. So that's great to see. I think that we want to buy one more piece of property. I want to buy a piece of land above 2,000 feet, and right now that's still feasible because a lot of that land was never used for wheat, so it's just basically kind of forest land. So you actually have to go clear the land, but it's not really that expensive. But if you look at the Walla Walla AVA, a lot of people know that, an AVA like Napa or Sonoma County or whatever, they realize it's an area on a map, but they don't realize a lot of them actually have altitude specifications as well. So in Walla Walla, the AVA actually ends at 2,000 feet. So if you go 2,001 foot, you have to call the wine Washington State wine. So at some point they're going to end up readjusting the Walla Walla AVA, I believe, and to see what's going on from there. But I want to find some land maybe at about 2,500 feet to see what Syrah does up there and to see what other kind of things we can do. And then in terms, after that size, I'm exactly where I want to be. You've been to a gazillion wineries in Europe, and you always ask the question, like, how big are you? And what always comes back, 100,000 bottles to 120,000 bottles. It's like the perfect size for a small winery. To me, it's like running like a 90-seat restaurant. You can do amazing food and still have control everything. And in wine, once you start getting into the 11, 12, 15,000 case, you're really running a different type of operation. So size-wise, I'm great. It's to continue to work with the growers that we work with and hopefully be able to keep these vineyards for the next 20 years. Awesome. And in perpetuity, and not get distracted. It's, all the time we get calls from, hey, we'd really like to work with you, so on and so on. And, one of the things we've learned is the grower winemaker relationship is super important, and it really has to click. Mm-hmm. I was never really a musician, but, obviously there are musicians that click and make some of the greatest music in the world. And you can put an all-star band together and they can't, make anything you want to listen to. And I find that growers and wineries are the exact same thing. We've worked with some very famous wineries where, for whatever reason, the grower didn't really appreciate the style of wine that we wanted to make, or we were just unable to convey exactly what we wanted. And we ended up saying, hey, we love you, but, we're really meshing with these growers over here, so we're going to go over there and work with them. And I tell some of the other winery owners and winemakers, are like, you're crazy. You dropped that vineyard. I'm like, yeah, just because we just didn't mesh, or the fruit was an outlier. So there's an amazing Grenache vineyard. I'm not going to name it. And I love the fruit every single year. The problem was it didn't fit with anything else that I made. So I either had to every single year make it as its own bottling, or it just made a wine that wasn't as interesting to me. So we eventually, a friend of mine wanted to do single vineyard Grenache. So we asked them if we asked the grower if they could take over the contract, and they're making some amazing Grenache out of the vineyard. So that to me is just continue to learn the vineyard sources. And as I'm saying it, I'm seeing there could be a lot of people out there who are like, that sounds really boring. But when you're actually doing it and seeing how they change and seeing how they grow up, I guess it's kind of like watching kids grow up too. So that's kind of where we're going. And then lastly, international. Before this whole pandemic started, we were about ready to do our first tastings in Moscow, which I think is amazing. Yeah. Last week I did a Zoom for customers in Singapore. And I've always said that you can't be a world-class winery unless you're in world-class destinations. And that's not just New York, Miami, San Francisco, LA. I want to be in Hong Kong. I want to be in Tokyo. I want to be in Moscow, so on and so on. So it's really taking Washington to the next level with an international reputation.
So that's smart. I believe that's the right path. So how do you see Walla Walla becoming more important in terms of the importance of Washington wines overall in the global market?
Yeah, that's a question that a lot of people are trying to figure out the answers to. And I think one of the benefits we have here is if you look at most of the major wine regions of the world, and it's almost unequivocally true for old world regions, is the established regions were either close to major cities or major ports, so they always had access to market. And obviously we live in a different age of trucking and flying things around the world, but if you look at what creates a wine region now, is the wine region has to have a big production driver that makes good wine. And luckily we have Chateau Saint Michel, which is able to, get their wines pretty much worldwide and start to develop that reputation. So, the big wineries start to develop that reputation, and then the smaller wineries can come behind and do different things and start to introduce their brands to the market. So thankfully that's already happening. And, people ask me, like, should Walla Walla have one variety? And, my answer is yes, and my answer is no. I mean, should everyone make rocks out of mix Syrah out of the rocks? I think it's iconic, it's world-class, it has a sense of place, it has the potential to be marketed all over the world, and that's probably why it is. But then are you discounting the Cabernet that can be made on Seven Hills, or the Cab Franc that you could find in some parts of the valley? So I think that relying on one variety kind of limits your choice a little bit, and kind of eliminates a lot of really good wine that's just fun to drink and really good. But I think that what I'm excited about is, it's kind of really the third wave. And a lot of people say, well, you have the first wave in Washington, which was in the 70s with the Rick Smalls and Gary Figgins and that kind of wave. And then another wave kind of started in the late 90s to maybe about the financial downturn, 2008. Then we kind of had a little bit of a stagnant period. And now you're seeing all kind of young people from all kind of backgrounds coming and making some really cool stuff.
For sure.
I've sat in some tasting rooms and been like, wait, you're doing what? You're doing, pet nat, this, natural, okay. I'm like, wow, it's really good. And I think that is where we've been very relatively formulaic in what you do in the Valley, to now the younger generations are being like, forget the rules, we're gonna do whatever we want. And on the whole being successful, and now the thing is, how do you get that to market, and how do you get people to, how do you get people in Tokyo to taste that and people in Hong Kong to taste that? And I think this downturn, particularly, we're sitting here right now talking to people all over the world. And I think with this pandemic, a lot of people have had to reimagine how they're doing business. And I think the old model of getting on a plane, getting in someone's car and going to see 8 restaurants a day, I think that's going to die. I think it'll still exist in a way, but get on video and talk to 300 people at a time. So
for sure.
I think that it's a very exciting, although it's a struggle for everyone, it's an exciting times in terms of change and innovation and new thinking of ideas, not just in the wine business, obviously.
Yeah, for sure. I completely agree. Yeah. I don't think that people getting in cars and speaking to people will ever go away in the wine business, because I think you need that. I mean, there have been some of the greatest wine conversations I've had growing up in Arizona, having winemakers or wine owners coming to talk to me at the restaurant, and they were very meaningful. And had lunch with Rupert Symington of Symington Family Wines, and that guy is really, really interesting guy. And talking to him and saying, yeah, like we've got robot feet with silicone little stompers now, instead of having people tread on the grapes, like we have little robot feet, and all the innovation that comes just from one-on-one interaction. It's this pandemic.
It's amazing how many. It's amazing how many characteristic Brits ended up in pork production. It's they're kind of leaders in being larger than life characters over there. So.
For sure. Yeah, it's really interesting to see how this pandemic has shifted people's mentality and the way they do business, because you have to be thinking on your feet at a time like this, for sure. So talking about the global wine market, with all these different things you're supposed to be have connected with, going to Russia and whatnot, what are some of the things that have brought you the most enjoyment as far as getting the name Gramercy Cellars out there to the world wine audience, to drinking more wine?
Yeah, it's funny. You'll maybe relate to this. So in our very early days, 2005, 2006, we didn't have a lot of wine. We did a little bit of distribution, but we didn't do a lot. And we had a couple of customers who bought a lot of wine from us, maybe 10, 20 cases at the beginning of the year. And I get a phone call from one of our customers, and he's like, wow, I'm at the French Laundry. I can't believe your wine is on the list here. I was like, oh yeah, they're great. I know some of the Somms, they're fantastic. It's an honor to be there. And he's like, yeah, I didn't know your wine was that good. And I was like, you bought about 50 cases of our wine over 3 years. So thank you for telling me it was a mercy buy, but that's great. So, to see, I was in, we toured, we went up to Valtellina, so on the border of Switzerland and in the mountains of Italy last year, and we walked into a random 2-star in Switzerland, and the wine was there, and I have winemakers. A lot of times is when another winemaker says, "Wow, I really like your wine." Particularly I think on our second vintage, I was in Walla Walla, and John Duval, legendary from Penfolds and, made how many vintages of Grange. I had known him from my buying days, and he's standing behind me in Starbucks, and he taps me on the shoulder. And he's like, "I had your Syrah last night. It's awesome." And I was like, "John Duvall just told me my wine's good." Yes. So the ability of, you still get starstruck every once in a while talking, even making wine for so many years. But, I just love to see how Washington as a whole is growing. When I started, Washington would always be in the other section. And now a lot of times, particularly in bigger restaurants, you'll actually see a Washington, maybe even a Washington by variety section. You'll see cabs together, you'll see Syrahs together. And I think that's great. So
sure. I think it shows the momentum that Washington is, clearly has, and is finally becoming more accepted in the global wine market. I know that you're a fan of Italian wines. When you're not drinking your own, what makes you happy? What do you gravitate towards?
Well, I mean, first and foremost is Nebbiolo. I feel like every time I try to bring something that's not Nebbiolo, the first thing my wife says is, "Why aren't we drinking Nebbiolo?" But for me, I think Nebbiolo is the complete package. It's a place we love to visit. I think if you've never been there, everyone, not that I want to have the place overrun with people every time I go, but it's just there's really nothing in the world like it. I mean, port can have some of the elements of just the visual stunt, beauty that Barolo and Barbaresco have, but when you put together the people, the food, the culture, the friends we have there, which is probably the most important part, and the wine itself, it's just a really special place. And the nice thing is there's a lot of Nebbiolo that you don't have to spend $100 to buy. You can go get Gemme and Gattinara and now these new emerging regions like Boca and Fara, $15-20 and you get great wine. That's one of the things I love to do is I like to get on Instagram and say, "Hey, I drank this last night." You might think it's $100, but it was 15, and you can get it in your local retail store, even in a place that might not be a major hub for wine. In addition to that, I mean, obviously, I love Verdicchio di Metallica. Not because it sounds like the metal band, but it's just the better region of the three that are there. Sangio, Sangiovese, particularly Chianti Classico, which I think is in a revolution right now. Mm-hmm. Even some more interesting things than what are going on in Brunello. Champagne is always a staple. Particularly small grower champagnes. For sure. Although they're getting harder and harder to find as they become more popular, but I think that's great for the champagne industry because it's been so dominated by 7 or 8 different conglomerates. I think it's great, and I think that if you think of the time that we're living through in the wine business, it's incredible. There's never been a better time. Exactly. Right now I can go to my local store, I can find natural wine from Beaujolais, I can find Barossa Shiraz, and I could probably find Poulsard from the mountains of France. It's crazy. Yeah. And when I started in the business, it was basically you write half a wine list of California, and then you put the classics, and then you have this like 6-section thing where you put your New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc and maybe your Pinot Gris, and maybe if you get crazy, you could do like a Cabernet Franc or a Vouvray. But it was now, you look at like a person like Paul Greco. I mean, he's crazy enough to just write an all Cabernet Franc wine list or something like that. So it's an amazing time for wine right now.
For sure. So do you have any parting thoughts for us or any last words?
No, well, I mean, I'd like to thank everyone for tuning in. Obviously when this whole thing ends, I just invite everyone to Walla Walla. And I think one of the special things of Walla Walla is just like if you visit places like Paso Robles or some of the smaller towns in California and Oregon, you'll still see winemakers in their tasting rooms. Occasionally I'm in my tasting room pouring wine or people want to come out and see the vineyards, and we still have a lot of room to be able to do that, people, and we love giving people the personal tour. So hopefully people will come back, and we're already seeing people come back as the tasting room opens. And I just invite you to try Washington wine, whether it's my wine or anyone else's from Washington. I think that there is some really interesting things and some things that you don't find in other regions. So it's really an exciting place to make wine, and then just kind of stay tuned and see what happens next. So it's a great time. So, and thank you for having me. It's been great to be able to talk for
an hour out of your day with me. So it's super fun chatting with you. You're always an interesting cat to talk to. You have a lot of intriguing ideas, and I appreciate your mindset and your thoughtfulness. So, quick shout out to tomorrow. It will be Monica Larner. She will be interviewing Pio Cesare tomorrow at 9 a.m. Pacific time. So check that out. Starting next week, I swing back to South Africa and begin interviewing with Matthew Day of Klein Constantia, and all of July will be dedicated to South Africa. So stay tuned until that. Until then, stay safe, drink well, and be kind to others. Cheers.